One question many people have raised after seeing Encanto is whether the armed conflict that forced Alma and Pedro to flee is based on real-life events from Colombia's history. Some Disney classics that have come before Encanto have a basis in historical violence, such as the war between Chinese and Mongolic states portrayed in Mulan or Britain's invasion of West Africa as featured in Tarzan. However, while the conflict in the Encanto village is an important part of its story, it takes a back seat until Abuela's flashback at the end of the film. It's also never given a specific name, which makes this question somewhat difficult to answer. However, there are some clues in Encanto's Colombian setting that help narrow down the actual historical events on which the movie is based. After the landmark success of Moana, for which Disney creatives worked with an Oceanic Story Trust to ensure that the film's cultural representation was meaningful and authentic, other Disney productions have formed their own such trusts to do the same. Raya and the Last Dragon paired with Southeast Asian cultural experts, and Encanto with those from Colombia. As a result, Encanto has received a largely positive reception for its portrayal of Colombia that's rich and realistic in the right ways in everything from its core themes to details of architecture, cuisine, music, and clothing. With all these real-life Colombian influences in Encanto, it's natural to wonder which armed conflict the film features in its backstory. Given the Encanto village's canonical setting in Colombia, rather than a made-up fantasy world, it's likely that the attacks that drove Alma and Pedro from their hometown do intentionally incorporate true historical events. Based on context clues, then, the conflict being referenced is probably the Thousand Days War. Some theories have also suggested that it could be La Violencia, but this would have to be a more metaphorical reference rather than a literal one, since the film's setting wouldn't quite line up. Encanto takes place during a civil war based on key details in Encanto, such as the character's dress, the type of camera used for the family photo, and Bruno's home entertainment setup inside the walls of Casita. Encanto's time period setting is approximately the 1950s. This would then place Alma and Pedro's backstory around the turn of the century, when the real-life Thousand Days War was taking place. This conflict, which ran from the 17th of October 1899 to the 21st of November 1902, was the product of civil unrest in which liberal and conservative groups fought to enact a decentralized or centralized government, respectively. Over the course of these 3 years, many towns and villages were ransacked and their residents displaced as refugees, which aligns with the experiences of Pedro, Alma, and the rest of the Encanto village. La Violencia, similarly, was a civil war rooted in conservative versus liberal ideology and messy elections, which lasted for 10 years from 1948 to 1958. It's unlikely, then, that the story of Abuela and Mirabel's grandfather in Encanto is meant to represent this conflict literally. The time period is wrong, for starters. Plus, if the Encanto writers had intended the conflict to directly be La Violencia, they'd no doubt have referred to it by name given the accuracy to Colombian culture and history in other areas. However, given that La Violencia could have been going on around the same time as the creation of the Encanto village, it's still a meaningful reference to understand, as well as a poignant connection between Abuela and the younger Madrigal generations. The Civil War background makes Abuela easier to empathize with. Encanto's Abuela going to extreme measures to ensure the Madrigals stayed strong makes much more sense when it was made clear what Abuela had lost in order to become the protector of not just their family, but an entire community of Civil War refugees. From a contemporary perspective, actions like shunning the discord-sowing Bruno seem incredibly harsh. The Encanto song We Don't Talk About Bruno is essentially about gaslighting neurodiversity. Abuela outcasts Bruno for the perceived risks posed by his unique powers of foresight. She's convinced that Bruno created, instead of simply predicted, the dark outcomes of his prophecies. However, considering Abuela's background and her role as the community's protector, she was simply doing what she thought was necessary in order to protect the entire Encanto village from further violence. As Encanto clarifies in the last act, this is no excuse for how she treated Bruno, but it does explain not only why Abuela shunned Bruno, but why she has such high standards for the madrigals. Indeed, Encanto's genius is in how it tackles intergenerational trauma and contextualizes it with family history. Not that it excuses Abuela's actions, but the context of growing up in a violent and bloody civil war does demystify her unfounded fears about Bruno somewhat. More importantly, it provides context on just why she's willing to go to such extreme lengths to keep the madrigals as pillars of the community. She's experienced firsthand just how dangerous things can be when people who aren't the magical family are in charge. Does this excuse Abuela? No, but understanding she's trying to keep together a community whose schisms and differences previously led to brutal and deadly carnage makes her paranoia easier to empathize with. Overall, Encanto does a good job of balancing its portrayal of true, violent history with a vibrant and detailed story filled with joy and love, all of which is rooted in a thoughtfully crafted, authentic rendering of Colombia.